I want to show you a really cool, really easy way to make colorful, classic looking fantasy world maps, and it's super fast too. Now I want to say up front that you don't need any drawing or painting skill to use this technique. Just follow along and you'll see how easy it is to use watercolors to color your map. First thing though, you're going to need a few tools. I'm going to be using this simple little set of watercolors. I like these little brick sets because they're super easy to use, don't require any cleanup. You just close the case and you're good to go. I'd say this is like a mid-range art supply, so if you can't get your hands on a set like this, you can absolutely use a super cheap kids watercolor sets, you know, the ones that are like a palette of the little round blocks of color. But I'll have links to everything I'm using down in the description, so you can get all the same stuff that I'm using. The trick to using watercolors is to get some good paper that's meant for that type of paint. And basically, because we're going to be soaking the paper with water, you can't just use any paper. You got to get paper that's meant for watercolor. Now, I've trimmed down this sheet of nice watercolor paper that I'm going to be using, but you can absolutely get a big pad of watercolor paper. Just get any paper that says it's meant for watercolor and you're good to go. You're also going to need a decent sized brush. In this case, I'm using just a really cheap brush that I got in a pack of 10 general craft brushes. You'll see that this thing, as the time lapse goes on, isn't good at all. There's hairs falling out all over the place, but you don't need anything fancy for this. A cheap brush will work just fine. The trick is you're going to need to find a brush that is the right size. So this one here is probably a little bit too big for the small map size that I'm going to be drawing. Really, you just want a brush that's big enough to spread around paint pretty quickly, but you still have a little bit of control over where the paint is going. I'd also suggest getting a roll of artist tape. This is just masking tape that's meant to be removed easily from paper. And lastly, you're going to want some normal map drawing supplies. I like to use just a regular pencil, a vinyl or a kneaded eraser, and some black micron pens in a variety of sizes. For this map, I'm going to be using a size 10 and a size 05. Oh yeah, you're going to want a mug to keep some water in for the watercolor as well. I know all this talk about tools might seem overwhelming, like this is gonna be some big, super involved painting process with a bunch of details, but really it's not. Once you get these tools, you can make a bunch of maps with them. You need watercolors to do this technique, and a few simple art supplies will go a long way to helping you create a cool looking map. I'm gonna start this process off by taping my little piece of watercolor paper to the table. Because we're going to load up this piece of paper with water, it's going to want to warp and curl. So taping the paper down isn't 100% necessary, but it will stop that warping from happening and make drawing on this piece of paper later much easier. Now, if you want to very lightly sketch out the shape of your world on the paper, you can, but it might be kind of hard to erase later once we've added the watercolor. So what I'm doing is making a little sketch on a separate sheet of paper just of this island that I want to draw, and I'm going to be dividing it up into different biomes. You can tell this is a really rough sketch. Going to have some forests and some grassland areas, some mountains, deserts, and swamps. This sketch is just to act as a guide or a plan for what my map is going to look like on the actual drawing. Once I'm confident with my plan, now it's time to start watercoloring. And all I'm gonna do is choose a color from the palette for each biome and paint that onto the paper, fill in the corresponding areas with those colors. Now, painting with watercolor is actually super fun and fairly forgiving. As you can see, I accidentally picked red instead of brown to start off this painting, and I'm trying to get rid of it just by adding a little bit of extra water. I've got my mug here, half filled with water. I'm just dunking my brush in so it gets nice and wet, not to the point where it's dripping water, but decently damp. Then I just swipe the brush over the brick of watercolor and start filling in an area on the paper. After you fill in the mountain area with the mountain color, then you can just dunk your brush back in the water, rinse it off, and then just pick another color and fill that area in. You can see how the first color is mixing in with this new color because the paint is still a little bit wet. This is really the key to making this style of map. We can really easily blend the green forests into the brown mountain areas. So there's like this nice transition happening. You don't have to actually do anything for them to blend. You're just touching one color up to the already wet second color, and they'll sort of just naturally mix together on the paper. I'm just going to repeat these steps and fill in each of the biomes with different colors, letting them mix and blend until the entire landmass is filled with all the colors that make up all the biomes. And while I'm doing that, let's talk about some of the things you might run into while using watercolor. One thing to know is if you don't have enough water in your brush, the paint pigment is really going to stick to the brush, and when you lay it down on the paper, it's going to be kind of like streaky and really saturated. There's no need to freak out about that. Just rinse off your brush, get it nice and wet, and then go over the saturated streak with a clean wet brush, and it'll turn it into this watercolor look that you wanted to begin with. You'll be able to move the pigment that's on the paper around, and it'll naturally spread out into the water that you're putting on the paper with the brush. The opposite is also true. If you feel like you aren't getting enough color on the paper, it just means that you have too much water on the brush. The ratio of water to pigment isn't quite right, so just dry off your brush, dab it onto the watercolor brick to get some pigment on there, and then tap it into the wet part of the paper. You can see that the pigment will spread out into the wet area, and you can even spread it around with the brush a little bit and add some saturation, some extra color back into the painting. And this is the real balance of watercolor, is just figuring out the right ratio of water to pigment. It can be a little tricky if you've never done it before, but I suggest maybe just doing a few tests, especially if you need to pick colors for your biome. Get a scrap sheet of watercolor paper, test out what the colors look like and how they feel with the wet brush. Spend 5 minutes playing around and you'll get the hang of it really, really quick. And the cool thing is it's really easy to add more pigment or more water to fix things. Like even once the paint dries, you can lighten up areas by hitting it with just a clean brush with a little bit of water on it. Super, super forgiving. Once all the land areas are filled in, I'm going to let the paper dry out and then move on to adding the water areas surrounding the island. This works exactly the same as before. I'm just getting the brush nice and wet and getting some blue paint on it and filling in the ocean areas. And the reason I let the land areas dry is so the ocean area doesn't mix as much with the land paint. Of course, if you hit the already painted area with the wet brush, it's gonna mix a little bit, but you won't get the real blending together that happens when everything is wet. Once the ocean is all painted in, I'm gonna let the paper get nice and dry, then start drawing the icons of the map on top. At this stage, you can take a pencil and lightly draw on top of the watercolor. Just be really gentle, especially when you erase later so you don't erase any of the paint off the paper. I would suggest using a kneaded eraser or just being really light to the touch with your vinyl eraser. I'm just gonna draw my icons straight in with pen, starting with the outline of this island. I've done lots and lots of videos about drawing world maps and even have a couple of guidebooks all about the process. So if you need help figuring out how to draw the actual icons, check out those videos and my Making Maps guides in my online shop or on Patreon. And really all I'm doing here is filling in each of the biomes with the icons that correspond. So I have this sort of orange-brown, putting the mountains in there. The green is for the forests and grasslands, and the darker green is for the swamps. The yellow is for the desert. Really, really simple. Of course, I've also added icons for cities and towns, connecting them with dashed lines for roads. And then I'll be adding a thin outline around the island and some waves to the water. None of the drawing is complicated, but it looks super cool once you get the black line art icons on top of the corresponding colors. And I think this is a really cool way to add color to the map. You can always go back with a smaller brush and add some shading into the icons, but I actually think it looks just as awesome keeping it simple like this. I really hope you give this technique a shot. It's super fun, and actually I think it's one of the fastest ways to color up a map. Let me know what you think of this technique down in the comments, especially if you try it out. And if you'd like to support the channel, check out the guidebooks that I make over on my Patreon. I do a new one every month. This month I'm making Flick Silverpin's Guide to Bizarre Bazaars. It's a book filled with a bunch of weird magic items that you can use in your tabletop role-playing games. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!